people became much more vocal and moved much further to the right when they saw, well, if an American president can get away with it, I can too.
They want to sit there and complain about cancel culture, but by the same token, these are folks who want to cancel us.
The 74 million are still out there, and half of them thought that the attack on the Capitol was a good thing.
It's always going to be a matter of what we do, not what they do. You want to see this end, you become proactive against it.
Welcome to the 50th episode of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and a host of the show. We started this podcast this past summer, the week millions began to pour into the streets, rebelling against white supremacy and demanding justice for George Floyd. When we began, the fascist Trump-Pence regime was tightening its grip on society. We called the podcast Inside Without Now, as the movement to get these fascists out became all the more urgent. The regime was doubling down on its deadly COVID program and unleashing violence on those who dared to call out white supremacy and mobilizing their rabid anti-science fascist base into the streets. In our first 50 episodes, we have covered Trump's refusal to wear a mask as a signal to fascism, how fascism works, the white supremacy, xenophobia, and misogyny that is the core of this fascism, Trump's death cult, the Christian Fascist movement and its embrace of Trump, American exceptionalism and American mythology, faith, resistance, and complicity under fascism. We brought you voices from the front line, from Portland, Oregon, to Los Angeles, California, to an organizer in a small town in North Carolina, in the suburbs of Chicago. We brought the experience and unique insight of a Holocaust survivor, the need to stop fascism, and organizing methods to mobilize all who can be united against it. Our first episode on the threat of a Trump coup was in mid-October, and we ran multiple forums in the wake of the election to dig into what just happened. Throughout all of this, we've mobilized people to act in the name of humanity. Guests have included scholars and writers such as Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Sarah Posner, Cornel West, Jeff Charlotte, Jason Stanley, Jarrett Yates Sexton, Eric Boehlert, Umair Haq, Federico Finkelstein, Andrea Chalupa, as well as activists Ajiris Dixon, Carl Dix, Michael Cord, and artists like Jodie Sweetin, Lily Wachowski, Frances Fisher, Rosie O'Donnell, and Rosanna Arquette. Much has changed since June, with the most significant being the fascist Trump-Pence regime is not in power any longer. There is a continued need for this community that you are a part of, and this show will continue to explore the fascist movement, its roots and manifestations, and how to stop it. When asked about people's favorite episodes, we got these responses from a listener in Texas. I highly recommend episode 17 from September 13th, 2020, featuring an interview with Professor of Jewish Studies, Joshua Shanes. In very clear terms, Shanes breaks down the features of fascism with very concrete examples of what it looks like and how it is manifesting here. He really brings out the stakes and human cost of fascism, including the moral cost of not uniting and mobilizing to stop it. Listening to it now, I think of what we narrowly escaped with Trump's election defeat, but I'm struck by how inadequate the collective response of the American people really was. Richie Marini, one of the producers of this podcast, wrote, "The Henry Giroux episode is one of my favorites, as it highlights that Trumpism isn't a fleeting moment, and fascism is a trajectory on which the United States is headed. Also really like the Umair Haq episode, which explores the economic dynamics that push individuals towards fascism." A listener in New York wrote, "Everyone is challenging every episode." Remember Jo Marie Burt's comments on why Trump had to be impeached to set the terms. She's still right. There can be no healing without justice. Lena Thorne, another one of the producers of this show, wrote, I think they're all worth going back to listen, but would skip to the ones with Jason Stanley, Jeff Charlotte, or Sarah Posner if you want to understand the fascist thinking, and would listen to the one with Agiris Dixon and the one with the Refuse Fascism Los Angeles folks if you want to learn more about how movements can effectively unite against fascism and defeating police state repression, respectively. I encourage everyone to take this opportunity to go back and listen to some of these episodes. Today, we are sharing 2 interviews. The first will talk history and philosophy with Susan Neiman, author of Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. And then you'll hear from Daryle Lamont Jenkins, founder of the One People's Project, foremost expert on the Proud Boys, where we'll talk about the current state of the fascist movement. I am excited to be welcoming Susan Neiman, the director of the Einstein Forum, to the Refuse Fascism podcast. She's the author of a truly fascinating book that I just finished reading recently, which is Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Her previous books, which have been translated into many, many languages, include Why Grow Up? Subversive Thoughts for an Infantile Age, Moral Clarity, A Guide for Grown-Up Idealists, Evil in Modern Thought, An Alternative History of Philosophy, The Unity of Reason, and Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin. So welcome, Susan. I'm so glad to have you with us.
I'm glad to be here.
So as a philosopher and student of history, I want to know, what do you see as the goal of a post-genocidal society? Is it unity? Is it atonement, reparations? Is it the prevention of it being repeated, the examination of what contributed to it, the uprooting of remaining oppressions? How do you see the goal of a post-genocidal?
That's a great list of goals. I mean, I would say that the absolutely first thing that has to be done is to prevent its repetition. That's the bottom line. And if they are around to bring to justice people who perpetrated murders in particular, I mean, then one can ask how you deal with crimes that are less than murder, but I think murderers need always to be brought to justice. Unity is an interesting word at this moment. I do not think there can be unity without some kind of atonement. And there's a big question about what atonement means. It means a lot of things. I think it's worth saying from the start, first of all, you don't have to atone for something that you never did. I think there's a big difference between guilt and shame. It's appropriate to feel guilty if you committed or were complicit in any kind of a crime. You can feel shame for your people, whether they're directly your relatives or something else. You can feel shame, but it's a mistake to try and ask people to feel guilt simply for belonging to a nation or a family that's committed crimes. But through shame, people can come to take a particular responsibility. You know, it's interesting. I was being asked recently about some kind of a program on homeland and what does it mean to feel at home in one place or another. And I've lived and worked in 3 countries. I've actually spent more of my adult life in Berlin than anywhere else, but I also lived in Tel Aviv for 5 years, and I come from the States. So I'm not somebody who easily feels at home in any one particular place. But when I was thinking about it, I realized actually shame is an important component of feeling at home somewhere. That is, I feel concerned that Germany has a right-wing racist party that's big enough to get into parliament, but I feel ashamed that 74 million people voted to re-elect Trump. And so even though I have not lived in the US for a long time, for long periods of time, that's sort of where I'm situated emotionally. I mean, I must admit I felt some pride, and I did a lot of volunteering in 2008, actually already in 2007 for President Obama. But a serious dose of shame is also involved in feeling part of a country, even if it's not shame for anything that you did in particular. It's worth also pointing out that it's probably hopeless to expect atonement or shame from everyone. And that was, in fact, one of the most important and provocative, but I think in the end, hopeful things that I have learned living for such a long time in Berlin and studying the ways in which the Germans have dealt with the Nazi past. It's quite a shock for most of us who are not Germans. It took me decades to figure this out. But in the first several decades after World War II, most West Germans thought of themselves as the worst victims of the war. I know. I've seen people make various kinds of faces when I state this. I've seen people's jaws drop. I was on a podium with Imam Kendi, and his mouth just completely fell open when I said that. But what's even more interesting is this. The litany runs like this. Well, we lost the war. Of course, we were victims. We lost the war. We lost a big chunk of territory. We lost 7 million people were killed. Our cities were in ruins and ashes. Our men, if they survived, were in POW camps or or wounded. We were hungry. Our economy was completely smashed. And on top of all of that, the damn Yankees wanted to make us acknowledge that the war was our fault. Now, I'm putting in the word Yankee because I hope you'll get the parallel that I'm drawing here. Germans didn't use the word Yankee, they used the word Ami. But if you look at the rhetoric in the first couple of decades after the war, they sound exactly like defenders of the lost cause. And I began to think, actually, that's normal. We would like to see our people as heroes. If something happens in the world and it's impossible for us to see them really as heroes, well, then we say they would have been heroes, but history made them victims. They were victims of history. And that is very much where West Germany was for a good 40 years after the war, the majority, not absolutely everybody, but the majority. And it was a long, slow, partly unwilling, certainly imperfect process of atonement. But in the end, they did something that no other country has ever done. That is, they made a third move, which was to say, yes, we suffered a lot during the war and especially afterwards, but other people suffered more and it was our fault. Now, this sounds to an American or, a Brit or most people in the world who are not German, it's like saying, yeah, you finally realize the earth is round. Congratulations. But it's a standpoint that was historically unique and new. And it's one that we in the United States still need to make.
Let's talk about the Vermont Exhibit in the 90s. And then if you could also talk about the effect that we should understand that it had on Germany and what would have to happen here in the United States to have something have similar effect. What are your thoughts on that? A, would that be desirable? B, would that be possible? And what might that look like?
Yeah, I think it's certainly desirable and certainly possible. So let me tell you a little bit about the Vermont Exhibit. It was started by a private foundation, the Hamburger Institute for Social Research. And the idea was to do something or other, a public exhibit for the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. And the people who did that exhibit had absolutely no idea that it was going to cause the furor that it caused, because the claims that they were making were for historians really not at all provocative or controversial. Until that exhibit, even though West Germany had begun to acknowledge its crimes, they always liked to attribute them to the SS, or it was some bad apples, or there were concentration camp guards, or so on and so on. But the Wehrmacht, the army, had something like 19 million men in it. And what that meant, given that there was a draft on, and the only way to avoid the draft was to do something worse than going to the army, like become a concentration camp guard, it means that every family had basically all the men between the ages of 17 and 60, usually, perhaps a little younger, all of them served in the Wehrmacht. And that was still a national myth that yes, the SS was bad, yes, Hitler was bad, but the Wehrmacht was simply defending its homeland from Bolshevism. That was the line. That was how they got people to fight. And it's important for some other questions. They did not get men to fight by saying, oh, let's go off to Poland and kill a lot of old men, women, and children. They wound up doing that, of course. Yes, you had to serve in the army, but you can't just force people to be in the army. You also have to motivate them. So the idea was we are defending our homeland from Bolshevism. And that that was that. So this is a myth that the majority of West Germans grew up with, that the Wehrmacht was basically just defending its homeland, and it certainly wasn't involved in war crimes. There may have been a bad apple here or there, but you could not say that the organization as a whole was involved in war crimes. And the Hamburger Institute decided to just simply show, yes, here are ordinary soldiers involved in war crimes, interestingly enough, and importantly, not against Jews, but against Slavic civilians of various kinds in Poland, Belarus, and one more country. I'm forgetting. There were 3 examples that they went into. They did not expect it to cause the kind of fury that it did, but it exploded the country. And it was shown all over the country, as well as in Vienna. It was firebombed at one place that it was shown. There was talk of bringing it to Parliament. That did not happen because there were plenty of people in the center-right party that's governing the country today that didn't want to look at what their fathers and grandfathers were doing. But it made an incredible impression on the country as a whole. And although it got some bad press in the beginning, a lot of criticism, in the end, there was a second exhibit for a variety of reasons. And in the end, the consensus was, yes, the Wehrmacht itself was a criminal organization. And before I answer the question about what could be done in America, I should point out I interviewed the person who founded and headed the organization. And it's a very interesting example of what someone might decide to do. His father was actually not a member of the Nazi Party, although he was a good buddy of Goering's, but he was a war profiteer. He had basically a monopoly on cigarettes. And if you're in a war and you have 19 million men at arms, you can imagine how rich you might become if you had a monopoly on cigarettes. So Jan Philipp Reemsma, the son of this war profiteer, inherited a lot of money and has spent most of his life trying to figure out what would be the decent thing to do with it. So he has done all kinds of projects, given away many millions, founded an institute. And one of the things that he did, besides his own writing and work on the subject, was this Wehrmacht exhibit. You ask if it could be done in the States. Interestingly enough, someone who read my book wrote to me and wanted to do something similar. I did put him in touch with my German friend, one of the people I know in Germany who's thought the most deeply about the Nazi period and what one does with it, partly because it affected him so very, very personally. I put them in contact with each other. I don't know where that's going at the moment, but he read to me recently and said he was also in touch with the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. You know about Brian Stevenson's work, I assume. Brian Stevenson is, in my view, the person in America who has done the most profound and important work in what the Germans call Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, which is translated as working through the past or working off the past. Brian Stevenson, an African-American lawyer from Delaware with a Harvard law degree, could have done absolutely anything he wanted once he finished the Harvard law degree and decided of all the things in the world he could have done, he was going to go down to Alabama and represent people on death row who had not gotten adequate representation at their trials. And he founded the Equal Justice Initiative. He wrote an incredible book called Just Mercy, which I highly recommend. There's also a movie that came out based on the book. And he's gotten many people off of death row, gotten convictions reversed, not as many as he would have hoped. He describes what it's like not to have a client executed, even though you're quite sure that they were innocent. Argued cases before the Supreme Court, but decided, and largely as a result of a trip to Germany when he was talking about the death penalty and was struck by German audiences saying, we couldn't have the death penalty. The Nazis had the death penalty. We can't go in that direction. And he began to look at the ways in which Germany did commemorate its shameful past, and he decided to do something like that in America. And so he built what's been informally called the National Lynching Memorial, which opened in 2018 in Montgomery, Alabama. Anybody who's listening to this, as soon as it's safe to travel, should actually go and see it, because although the pictures are impressive, they really don't do it justice. It's an extraordinary memorial. And one of the extraordinary features of the memorial is something that he borrowed from Germany, but it hasn't been, for various reasons, and of course the pandemic happened as well, it hasn't yet been activated. The idea is, in addition to the columns that document lynchings for every county in America where there were lynchings, there's a double column outside the memorial. And the counties in which lynchings occurred are meant to do some research, find out about the people who were murdered, find out about as much about the case as they can, and then they're supposed to come and claim their column and put it in their county, so that we would have, in the same way that you have Confederate iconography all over the place, you would also have iconography marking the fact that people were lynched in all kinds of places, certainly not only in the Deep South, even if there were more people lynched in the Deep South. Now, one thing that Brian said to me when I had the pleasure of interviewing him when I was working on the book was, there were white people who opposed lynching and you don't know their names. And it's terribly important that we remember their names as well. And I think as the United States is now going through a period in which we are relooking at our history in a way that 5 years ago was just beginning and seemed almost impossible, we need to remember that we need heroes too. A nation doesn't only need to acknowledge its crimes, it also needs to find people who stood up against crimes or stood up for justice, people who represent the values that we want our communities to represent. And when I say we need heroes, I most emphatically do not mean that we need saints. And some of the discussions that have gone on, just in the last couple of months, say over Abraham Lincoln, as one important example. If we start looking for saints, well, first of all, we're not going to find very many. I mean, you know what the Catholic Church goes through just to decide whether somebody counts as a saint or not. But saints aren't models. We need models of righteous behavior in ordinary, flawed human beings. And that's something that we need to be very careful with going forward.
I was thinking as I was reading your book about how you go through any town in Germany and you see the legacy, you see a process of people that confronted their past. You see people that, including the heroism that you spoke of. In many ways, there's markers to those who did take heroic action. And then you think about the US and the monuments that exist in this country and the genocide and slavery that existed, the Confederacy, and the monuments that exist in this country. And it's very stark what people remember. In Germany, the genocide was ended by the intervention of outside forces who had a major say in how it was reconstructed. It seems that the process needed to be kickstarted through an absolute shutdown. In the US, the Union that righteously beat the Confederacy had been up until that point waist deep in slavery. It continued many of the same dynamics in different forms. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, can a society really take this on from within? And if so, how do you see that? Are there other major differences that you see?
Yeah. Let me just take a step back. I don't idealize Germany. They did not do everything right by any means whatsoever. And when you say in every town there's a memory, some towns more than others, I'll tell you. What there isn't is a generic, Johnny Reb, Johann Wehrmacht. That there is not. And swastikas are outlawed. But, I live in Berlin. There's a reason I live in Berlin. Berlin was always left-wing, even though it was the capital of the Reich for a while. And the kinds of memorials that exist here are significantly more than anywhere else in the country, although many small towns do have local people who decide they want to explore their history and face their history. About heroes, there really weren't very many. My guess is nearly every town in Germany has a Hans and Sophie Scholl Straße. There was a very good movie made about Sophie Scholl, actually. I think it won the best foreign film. Maybe it's more than a decade ago. It's a long time ago, but it's still a good film, still worth watching. But these were two students who distributed leaflets. They were guillotined for it. I sometimes think they're held up as examples, not particularly of how to behave, but they're held up as examples to say, look, they actually accomplished nothing and they got killed for it. It's complicated. There were genuine people in the resistance who actually made something of a difference. And there are some memorials to them, but there weren't very many. The Allies banned swastikas and reference to names of Nazis in street names and so on. The Nazi regime really did not last much more than 12 years, so there wasn't a lot of time to build statues. And that's a good thing. But the Allies did ban Nazi symbols. There were plenty of those on buildings, and there were plenty of, Adolf Hitler squares and so on and so on. But their official attempts at denazification, including the Nuremberg trials in the West, did not work. And the West Germans made fun of them. They made fun of them. They were contemptuous of them. And when the Cold War got hot or lukewarm or whatever it was in the late 40s, the Americans quietly dropped their denazification projects. They knew that the best people they could find to fight communism were all Nazis, because communism was as central a pillar of Nazi ideology as was anti-Semitism. So they became much less interested in re-educating old Nazis and much more interested in recruiting them to fight the Cold War. And that's what happened in West Germany. Now, it might be time to talk for a minute about East Germany. Well, let me just finish with West Germany. So the assumption that the process of atonement was imposed from the outside in the case of the West actually doesn't work. Because yes, there was something imposed from the outside. The Germans hated it, and it was ended 5 years after the war was over. There was basically none of it was in place. Very, very different, the East German situation, because when the war was over, the people who formed the leadership of East Germany, and I don't just mean the political leadership, but also the cultural leadership, which was very, very important. East Germany emphasize the importance of culture in bringing a nation together and creating national values. All of those people were communists, and that means that they were either in concentration camps or they were in exile to save their lives during the Nazi period. So they were genuine anti-fascists, unlike people in the West. They really were anti-fascists. And I've got to say, they were absolutely worried about what to do with a population that had been living under Nazi propaganda for 12 years, which was one reason why censorship there was pretty strict. Now, it is also true that in the West, there was a vetting by British and American occupying forces of who got to open newspapers and television stations. And that vetting was mostly done by emigres, most of them Jewish, who either came back with the army or were invited back after the war was over to tell them, please, we can't even read the language, who was really a Nazi and who was not, since everybody, of course, was saying they weren't really a Nazi. So the television and the radio and the papers were not run in the West by people who were deeply complicit, but they were certainly run by people who, if they hadn't been members of the Nazi Party, they were highly conservative. In particular, they shared the anti-communism of the Nazis. In the East, there was a real attempt, in a sense, from within. Now, how much was it within? Well, these people had been in exile in Moscow or in Mexico or Brecht in the United States. So they were regarded with some suspicion by their country folk, but They were not foreigner. They were Germans who had a commitment to building the other Germany. And they did a somewhat better job. It also wasn't perfect, but they put more old Nazis on trial. They got more old Nazis out of offices. I mean, in the West, everything except the first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, everybody under him, almost everybody under him, had been a Nazi. And that wasn't only true of the government. It was true of the universities. It was true of the schools. It was true of the police forces. There were some old Nazis in certain positions in East Germany, but far fewer. There was a real attempt to get rid of them. There was a rewriting of the school curricula. This was not something that was done in West Germany. In West Germany, people who went to school in 50s or 60s will tell you, history just stopped in 1933. We didn't learn anything. Occasionally I meet somebody who claims they did, but the solution was just simply not to talk about current history, whereas the East Germans had a lesson plan. It talked about Nazi crimes. They renovated the Buchenwald concentration camp and turned it into an archive, a research center, and basically every school child in East Germany had to go at some point to Buchenwald. Now, did they tell the whole story of Buchenwald? They did not. In fact, it's quite interesting to look at exactly what they did with that. They wanted a heroic story whereby the communists in Buchenwald liberated themselves. It's actually not quite true. They helped out, but it was American soldiers who liberated Buchenwald. And there were other distortions in the East German story. Again, I am not saying that they told the truth all the time. And they certainly distorted and instrumentalized their version of modern German history, which is that the communists told us that Hitler would lead to war. That was true. It was absolutely true. No question about it. The communists fought heroically against the Nazis. This was certainly true of the Red Army. Americans and Brits like to forget this, but there were 13 million Red Army soldiers who fell in the battle for the liberation of Europe, and just not anything close to that kind of a sacrifice. I mean, I don't want to deny the sacrifice that American and British soldiers made, but if you're looking at who won the war, you have to be grateful to the Red Army. So that's certainly true. And there were members of the Communist Party who did engage in serious acts of resistance under the Nazis, but there were not all that many. But I understand why they wanted to tell a heroic story. And on the whole, the main truth that got told in East Germany is a very simple one. The Nazis were criminals, and defeating them was a liberation. And as strange as it may sound to American ears, that is not a truth that got told by the government in West Germany for 40 years. So what's so interesting is you had a top-down attempt in East Germany to force people to get rid of fascism, get rid of fascist tendencies. It worked better than the absence of such an attempt, obviously, in the beginning in West Germany. But it's also possible to say that because starting in the early 60s, you had church groups, you had intellectuals, you had later students. That's what the 60s were about in Germany. People who were angry at the West German government for not doing anything. People who were angry at their parents and their teachers for having been Nazis or having been complicit. That they did a lot of grassroots work that in a certain sense you might say is more effective and long-lasting than work that comes from the top. My own view is that really we need a mixture of both. We need good leadership at the top, and we need community activism coming from the ground up. And neither one of those will do it by itself.
That leads me with a couple questions moving into the present context. Trump is in part a product of American refusal to confront and take accountability for our past. We see that in the 74 million that voted for a genocidal white supremacist. But now he is part of the past that we must hold to account. Clearly, an impeachment trial was not the vehicle to take a holistic approach to that. How do we, and perhaps can we, hold Trump and his enablers accountable in a way that really contextualizes it appropriately?
Well, I've got to say, I'm enjoying a bit of a break, but I don't quite share your optimism that Trump is part of the past. I am very concerned, not just about 2024, I'm concerned about 2022 and what the Georgia state legislature seems to be on the verge of doing in restricting voting. It's appalling. What we have right now is not a genuine democracy. White conservative voters have infinitely more power, but these people are not gone. They're simply preparing for their second round. And it's very important that we be prepared as well. And also, I've got to say it, as much as I care about, I think symbols are important and I care about them a lot, but we need to not get distracted by Dr. Seuss, etc., and focus on these things which will have an enormous impact. So if we can get rid of this danger, then we can talk about long-term ways of Americans looking to a better understanding of their past. And I completely agree with you. In fact, I wrote this myself. I think that it is clear that the backlash to having a Black family in the White House for 8 years, that even if you don't agree with every piece of policy that President Obama passed, although we do now know how little he was able to pass because of the Republican-dominated Senate for the last 6 years of his office, but the fact that a Black family spent 8 years being models of dignity and integrity and excellence clearly enraged a lot of people. And I believe that if we had worked through our history better than we have, that we might have prevented that outcome. But first things first, we need to prevent it happening again. And those people are there. They are not gone.
I really appreciate your point about them not being gone, that they are not the past. And I want to just clarify a little bit of how I see it, is that a second term would have set us on an accelerated course to consolidated fascist rule, and truly an existential nightmare for people all around the globe. And that this was narrowly averted through an election that was nothing less than a showdown over the form of rule in this country, an election that Trump and his goons fought to overturn. And that we averted this nightmare truly is a relief. That said, this virulent fascist movement with its millions of followers is regrouping, and it's doing so on the lie of a stolen election, this toxic stew of Trumpism, and the conditions that gave rise to this fascism still exist and will continue to fuel this movement. And so it's extremely important that people stay vigilant, but seek to understand and prevent this movement from re-seizing power as they are moving to do. We should learn at how quickly they were able to seize the narrative and dominate the conversation very early on when Obama was in power with the Tea Party movement. And while they haven't as quickly re-seized control, that doesn't mean that they won't and aren't. And so I think it's important what you were saying in terms of the danger that's posed.
I could just add one thing to that. I have made most of my adult life in Europe, and in the run-up to the election, certainly after 2016, I had a lot of friends saying, boy, are you lucky to live over there. And in the run-up to the election this year, I had lots of people trying to see if there was some way they could get European citizenship. Americans have the idea that they could get away from Trump if they left the country, and they cannot. To my sorrow, the Trump administration proved that American power, American soft power, is really still quite extraordinary, even among people who can be very critical of America. But if you look at the right all over the world, from India to Brazil and a whole lot of places in between, people became much more vocal and moved much further to the right when they saw, well, if an American president can get away with it, I can too. And had we been given a second term, Noam Chomsky said it would be the end of the world. He really did. He said Trump was worse than Hitler. He got a lot of flack for that. But his argument was Hitler wouldn't have destroyed the entire planet given the climate crisis. So I was very, very frightened. But I do want to warn myself as much as anybody else, don't relax too much, because the 74 million are still out there, and half of them thought that the attack on the Capitol was a good thing.
Such an important point. I wanted to ask the question of morality. And how do you see a way that people in the United States can reclaim some of the morality that they may have lost? If they were passive for the past 4 years, if people that were passive as children were put in what can only be called concentration camps in this country at the border, people who were passive as Muslims were banned from entry into this country, or passive as this regime moved to erase LGBTQ people from public society. If people were passive during that time, how can they reclaim their morality? How can they become a moral person now?
It's a good question. Not one that I've exactly been asked in that form before. I do think small community-to-community dialogue works. I've seen it work, particularly in the Deep South, when I was researching this book and looking for examples of people trying to overcome racial divides and face up to racist history. And I have seen it happen. What our problem is right now is that we really do have alternative facts. That is, I don't know people who says it's great to separate children from their families and put them in cages. I don't think that's what people say. I think people tell themselves stories about why that's the lesser of all possible evils. Nor do I think that people, are in favor of whether or not Muslims are seen as full human beings or whether they're seen as terrorist strangers. And that's, of course, something that can be changed. As the Nazis succeeded in dehumanizing Jews, which they did through all kinds of popular propaganda, we can certainly rehumanize people. Interestingly enough, I think one of the things that's happening that's very, very good, the number of Black contributions to culture, the number of books, the number of films, which allow us to get more of a perspective on what it is to be an African American in this culture. Its cultural change eventually produces moral change. The work that's been done to make LGBTQ citizens be your neighbor next door, that has happened in the last 20 years. It was not imaginable 20 years before. So it's always important to remember the progress that we have made, because that's not to rest on your laurels, but it's to say, look, we've made some progress that can give us strength and hope to make some more. I think that's very important to remember. I think we need more cultural production in these areas, and you build on that. Whether that will lead all by itself to a different morality in the United States is another question. I'm going to throw something out to you just because this is a very long-term project, but it's one that Americans are going to need to face. 4 times a year, living in Berlin, I have to pay a television and radio tax of about $50. And I am so happy every time I see that's gotten taken off my bank account, because I know, even though I watch rather little television, I know that my small contribution and that of whatever it is, 88 million other citizens, that means that this country doesn't have a Fox News. And it not only doesn't have a Fox News, it has an extremely high functioning, detailed system of public radio and television, which does long form interviews on all kinds of serious subjects. The kind of conversation that you have on your podcast, that's the kind of thing that you can get in German radio all the time. I mean, an hour's worth of serious, interesting, thoughtful conversation on practically any issue. And if the United States doesn't see with everything from Russian bots to Breitbart to Fox, that a democracy lives from a seriously good media and a shared basis of information, we are going to be lost in the long run. Now, I know, of course, people will say, oh my God, state television, it'll be propaganda. Nah, there are ways to guard against that. I mean, they have very, very clear guides so that the government does not directly interfere in any of the content of any of the radio and television. And you could say we have PBS and NPR, but how small their audiences are and how poorly funded they are. Every time I'm in the States, they always seem to be doing a fundraising drive. So at this point in time, I think that is perhaps the most important long-term project that we can work on. But if we don't begin to establish a reliable source of information, I don't see a real future for American democracy.
That was Susan Neiman. You can find a link to her book in the show notes. The refusefascism.org editorial board recently issued a statement which reads in part, quote, "The virulent fascist movement, with its millions of followers, is regrouping on the lie of a stolen election and the toxic stew of Trumpism, and the conditions that gave rise to this fascism still exist and will continue to fuel this movement." End quote. The emergency that prompted the founding of Refuse Fascism is over, for now, but the danger that this fascist movement could make another concerted power grab is clear. You can stay connected with others who refuse to accept a fascist America by signing up for email and text alerts on our website, refusefascism.org, and follow on social media at Refuse Fascism. Next, I'll share a recent conversation I had with Daryle Lamont Jenkins. Well, I am really glad to introduce Daryle Lamont Jenkins. He's the executive director of the One People's Project, which was founded in 2000 to seek to combat right-wing groups and individuals by exposing their threat to the world. Daryle is an expert on street-level fascists in the U.S., including but not limited to the Proud Boys. And they've gone through a major transformation over the last few months. And as someone who has studied these movements, in particular these white supremacist militias, what are you focusing on now? What questions are you looking at? What should we be paying attention to? And in particular, was there anything that you learned in the past few weeks that you feel more people should be paying attention to?
I think one of the most important things to remember is, and to be honest with you, the lessons that we learned after Charlottesville. One, we do have a lot of strength that we have never really tapped into, because after Charlottesville, we learned that we can marginalize these characters in ways that we were told we couldn't do. We couldn't shut down their websites. We couldn't remove them from their places of employment, which would include being a cop or what have you. We also learned after Charlottesville, those on the other side will definitely try to rebrand, will lay low for a little bit and then come up differently in a way that doesn't alarm folks. And that's exactly what they did. I mean, we knew that the Proud Boys existed in Charlottesville. Some of them were around in Charlottesville, but we started seeing them in prominence after Charlottesville because they were a multiracial group and they can deflect the charges that the alt-right was catching about being racist by saying, hey, we have a Black friend, we have a Black leader, or what have you. The same thing is going to happen now. How they rebrand, how they organize is going to shift. It's going to move somewhere else. It's always just simply going to be a matter of those that are trying to keep tabs on them to pay attention to where they go and just basically chase them wherever they go and just let people know that these things are still going on. I think one of the things that really ticks people off when it comes to Charlottesville, when it comes to the past 4 years in general, is when you look at January 6th, a lot of people, especially a lot of reporters, were asking us, does it feel like an I told you so moment? And I told them, no, Charlottesville was kind of like I told you so. January 6th is more like, why aren't you listening? That is the concern that we have now. Why do we keep having that particular problem of folks who keep on seeing the same thing, but not doing a damn thing? That has to change. That really does.
Do you think that the Proud Boys and similar groups, do you think that they've become more mainstreamed?
I think they have. I think especially when it comes to the Proud Boys and the 3%ers and the QAnon crowd, especially if you have a congresswoman that's coming out of QAnon, Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, she's not the only one that comes out of that, by the way. When you look at the Proud Boys, when you look at Oath Keepers, the two groups that they're looking at from January 6th, they did have a degree of mainstream. The Proud Boys were nice and cozy with Donald Trump. More to the point, Roger Stone and other conservative figures like Ann Coulter and Michelle Malkin have used them for security. I think that's telling. Now, we'll see what happens to them in the future, considering that they are the group that everyone is taking the closest look at in the wake of January 6th. But even if they cease to exist, which I pretty much expect their presence will be diminished, at least by the end of this year, that just means that those that were a part of the Proud Boys that don't go to jail are going to start something else, join something else, and the Proud Boy name is just going to be persona non grata, just basically non-existent. The attorney who owned the copyright to the name threw it in the public domain. He got rid of it. He got rid of the copyright, just the trademark, just a couple of weeks ago. And that was pretty telling. He was the registered agent and he just dissolved the incorporation, dissolved the trademark protections, everything. No use for a name, not that name.
What do you think the implications are for society at large that they were able to become so mainstream?
I think the implications are, and I alluded to this earlier, we are not recognizing the strength that we have within ourselves to keep these groups from growing. We don't do the things that we need to do, and we should. And because of that, they felt that they could get free reign. It's like one of the things that I noticed during the lead up to January 6th, they had two rallies. They had one in November and one in December. And the Proud Boys had the run of DC in both times. The first time, in November 14th, they went out and stabbed a few folks, and they, along with some of the 3%ers and other maggots, they vandalized the Black Lives Matter mural over at Black Lives Matter Plaza. And the reason why they was able to do that is because there was an attitude amongst the more liberal side of our aisle, so to speak, to stay home, to ignore them. We won, Trump lost. And everyone was saying, don't do that. If you do that, they feel that they can do whatever. And they say, let them do whatever. And it's like they never learned. So they did whatever in November, and Black Lives Matter Memorial was vandalized. So they did it again in December. By the way, there's a guy named Brian James, a former Klansman, straight up neo-Nazi. He ran the Vinlander Social Club, founded the Vinlander Social Club. He was out there in November running roughshod over everything. And he said that was the greatest day of his life. He's a Proud Boy. In December 12th, you heard the same rhetoric coming from the liberals saying, stay home, we won, they lost, yada, yada, yada. And we said, no, didn't you see what happened in November? Well, we did see what happened in November, and we saw it again happen in December. But this time, some more people came out and started stabbing back whenever the Proud Boys started stabbing folks. So we did fight back, but they attacked Black churches on December 12th. The Proud Boys decided to rip down Black Lives Matter banners and set them on fire off private property, off of those churches' property. Now we cut to January 6th. Now they know we are not coming out. Now they know that we are not coming out in a force that is going to push them back, especially with the Democrats and the liberals saying, don't come out. And what happened? They stormed the Capitol. They got people killed. The response, when I said on Twitter, was, this is why we come out. The liberals come back with, well, it was probably a good idea that we didn't come out this time, as you can see. So if you had came out the past 2 times, they would have never come out like this on January 6th. How do we know that? How do we know that? Because on July 6, 2019, we did come out. We did come out when the Proud Boys decided to come out en masse, and they stayed their ass on Freedom Plaza the entire day. It's always going to be a matter of what we do, not what they do. You want to see this end, you become proactive against it. You can't just give it rhetoric. You got to end it every time you see it.
I appreciate that so much. It was one of the most painful things to see how people were kept from doing the one thing that could have changed everything, which was to assert themselves in the streets and to not cede the ground to fascist lies and fascist violence. And people thought that they were somehow appeasing them. You can't appease these forces. You give them an inch and they take a mile. And I just really appreciate what you were saying. I mean, I just imagine what difference would it have made if people had come out in October, November, December. You wouldn't have had that.
The fact of the matter is we still need to come out, and we don't necessarily have to come out in the sense of put our physical bodies out there whenever they have a rally. Some folks can't do that. I can appreciate that. I'm going to submit that you shouldn't wait until they announce a rally. I mean, we know who they are. We know where they are. We know what they are. When you hear somebody saying that they're about this and that, shut them down. They want to sit there and complain about cancel culture, but by the same token, these are folks who want to cancel us. That's their culture. That's where this all comes from. So the truth of the matter is we're protecting ourselves from that crowd every time they come out. Yes, they have freedom of speech. Yes, so do we. We use that freedom of speech to respond. And we also have the right to say, you will not go so far in my world. That's not going to be the case. And it's worked before. It will work again. You just have to stop listening to the wrong people.
I wanted to switch gears for a moment because for good reason, there's been a lot of talk about fascist organizing in the military. And I was wondering, what's your sense of how much influence and organization these forces have in the military, the police, the National Guard, state and local governments, or other institutions that people may not be aware?
Well, I was in the military, I should say. It wasn't the most exemplary service, but I was in the military 30 years ago. And I can tell you right now that on paper, it's a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You cannot be a neo-Nazi. You really can't be politically active. I mean, an activist on the streets or whatever while serving in the military. That'll get you in trouble, or it's supposed to. Having said that, there's some folks out there that I know that have served in the military and never had any problems. I can think of one guy out in Pennsylvania named Steve Smith, who said straight up, he never had any problems while he was a Nazi in the military, in the army. And this guy is founding member of at least one well-known white supremacist group in Pennsylvania. And he's also a Republican committee man right now, elected. Pittston, Pennsylvania. When you look at the kinds of allowances like that, and there are others like that, you start to wonder, well, why is that the case? Because the only time they seem to get in any kind of trouble is when, once again, we start sounding the alarm. And even that is a hit or miss. I mean, I can tell you right now, there's somebody that I have been concerned about for the past couple of years. His name, and I can drop his name because we have it on our website, onepeoplesproject.com. His name is John Stortstrom. And he was an associate of a neo-Nazi named Matthew Heimbach. We found out later that he is associating with groups like Identity Europa, but he is also a military contractor that makes explosives in Maryland. We sounded the alarm on him. They suspended him for a summer with pay, but they had to reinstate his position because according to them, it was still his right to believe as he wished and do as he wished. But remember what I said earlier. If you are involved in any kinds of political activity, I'm not necessarily talking about campaigns and such, but I'm just talking about activism things. If you're involved in that, then you are violating Uniform Code of Military Justice. Now, he's a civilian, so that probably was the exception to the rule. But considering the positions and the groups that he was affiliating himself with, that should be the first thing to say. This person might not be compatible with the military, civilian or otherwise. Those kinds of allowances is what's causing a lot of problems out there. A number of people that was out there on January 6th were military. That was one of the concerns that they had when they brought the National Guard in. They actually relieved a couple of service members that was there during Inauguration Day because of some things that they might have said online or some associations that might have been apparent. It's now at the point where you're going to have to say, clamp down on it. And now we have to insist on them just basically purging the ranks of every last member that is about these kinds of ideals. But we aren't really talking about a institution that seems to be all that eager to do so. I mean, granted, the new head of the military is saying that he is going to do so, but remains to be seen. We have to see. I mean, we've been fooled before. So let's see what's up.
I'm wondering, what is the current relationship with these forces that are terrorizing people in the streets, the people that were out on January 6th? With Trump now out of power, how close are these forces with the fascists that are still in power? The Howleys, the Cruzes, the state GOP folks?
I think, honestly, we're going to find out. So there one thing that you could probably bank on is that maybe this time you're going to see some upper echelon behinds get kicked because the war came to them this time. This time, the people who we've been trying to get to understand what kind of a threat these characters were about to be killed by those same people directly. So they might start doing a real investigation in this regard. We're going to see. When you look at Ted Cruz, who first said he condemns the Proud Boys, but then you see him in pictures with Henry Tarrio, the leader of it, or when you see people like Marjorie Taylor Greene adopt the QAnon policies and then get elected, and when you see people like Kelly Loeffler, who is no longer in the Senate, and one of the reasons why she's not in the Senate anymore is because people are taking issue with the fact that she's associating with known Klansmen and members of the National Alliance while she's campaigning. When you ask those kinds of questions are very valid because we need to know now. We really need to know. And most importantly, we need to stop tolerating it because I think that's one of the reasons why they get away with it so much is because simply we just allowed it and we can't allow it anymore. One of the guys that we don't even talk about anymore is Steve King, the former representative out of Iowa. It took 7 years for Republicans to say that there was something wrong with him, and then they ousted him. But in those 7 years, they let him do whatever he wanted to do without calling him out. Where was he last weekend? He was speaking not at CPAC, but at AFPAC, the America First Political Action Committee conference, also being held in Orlando, but held in Orlando by people who were known white supremacists and known anti-Semites. He spoke at that conference, which is not to say he doesn't have a relationship with CPAC because he spoke at CPAC during a presentation that included Peter Brimlow from VDare, a white nationalist website. And that was in 2012. So you got to find out exactly who it is that's involved with this kind of nonsense. I mean, some of them make themselves obvious, but we got to know for sure. And I think we're going to due to what happened on January 6th.
I'm wondering, what do you think has changed with Trump and Pence no longer in power for the fascist movement in the streets?
I want to say nothing's changed, but I think the only reason why I would say that is because we got to keep our heads about ourselves and not think for a minute that all of this is over. But as I said, after January 6th, there is a shift. Now people are empowered. Now people are in control that they were going after. They're going after, and they're going to want to kick their behinds. So some of them are laying low these first few months, these first 100 days, if you will. It remains to be seen just how much they lay low as the year goes along. They're going to find ways to get into the middle, to get into the thick of things. If there's anything that showed us that they were planning on doing something, it's the CPAC and AFPAC conferences that happened on just last weekend. They are still organizing. That's what those conferences are for. And they are going to try to push forward fascism just like they were with Trump. They just don't have their, well, figuratively speaking, they don't have their guy in the White House anymore. But they definitely are still going to mobilize. They're going to find their way to do something somehow. And that's one of the reasons why people are concerned about anything they do, even if it's just a rumor like March 4th. So people are going to keep their eye on them regardless. I mean, we all have to remember that this is bigger than Trump and this is bigger than Biden. They're not really all that pissed off at Biden or all that supportive of Trump. They're trying to come after us. We were not supposed to be in the positions that we are in today. I should not be able to speak to you like this right now. You should not be allowed to have this Zoom conference. And they are going to do everything they can to make sure that you and I don't exist. They'll fail. They'll fail, but they're going to try. They are going to try, and we're going to have to be prepared for that.
I think that sometimes our strength is definitely underestimated, but so is theirs repeatedly, as people like to shrug it off. So I think that you sounding the alarm and continuing to get people to see what is just beneath the surface, I think is really important. And sometimes, like at CPAC and the American First Conference, it's not beneath the surface at all. It's overt. It's in your face. I'm wondering, what do you think people who are concerned about the continuing danger of fascism, what do we do in this moment? What do you ask people to do?
I think it's a case of just basically following the people that are monitoring these folks if you can't do it yourself. You can go to One People's Project. You can go to idavox.com, which is our news line. You look out for Unicorn Riot. These are good outlets. These are good organizations to look at if you want to get that information so you can apply it to what's going on in your community. Hear what Black Lives Matter has to say about the situations in the streets and put all of this together and then just make the moves that we are supposed to make. I mean, I remember back in the day, that campaign, World Can't Wait. I always told people, if World can't wait, what the hell are we waiting for? The information is out there. If you want to get involved, start working within your community with like-minded folks.
On our 50th episode, I want to thank all our listeners and all those who have shared this podcast. Special thanks to those who follow the show and listen each week. We hope you'll rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And make sure you follow and subscribe to get the latest. Stay connected with the movement on social media. Follow at Refuse Fascism. We started ads last week on social media and would like to continue. We also want to start running fully transcripted episodes and have Spanish translation. So please consider chipping in to help make this possible. Donate at refusefascism.org or Venmo, refuse-fascism, or give via Cash App, Refuse Fascism. Make a gift of $50 or more for this milestone, and you'll receive a beautiful Heart Humanity enamel pin as a thank you if you provide your mailing address. As always, I want to hear your thoughts on this episode, the show in general, questions you have, guests you'd like to see on, ideas you think we should explore. Reach out via Twitter at Sam B. Goldman or write me, Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org. Special thanks to Lena Thorne, Richie Marini, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode, and Richie and Lena for making these 50 episodes. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Stay safe, not silent.